The intention of Russia was to eradicate Ukraine as a distinct, independent nation and culture. When Putin says Russia and Ukraine are one, he doesn't mean it as in brotherly love one. He means Ukraine should not exist as an entity separate from Russia. And nowhere will you ever hear Chomsky or any of the other online leftist clowns who are defending Chomsky say this, because it's very uncomfortable and it brings down all their other arguments down.
When the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part.
Well, people, I am back. I think I need a bit of an explanation of why I've been away. As some of you heard in my last videos, I came to London after over a year of absence. And, well, let's just say it was a bit of a shit show. I was staying at a friend's place, then I got COVID, moved out, then came back. Planned a million things, did not have time to make videos, and at the very last moment, the opportunity arose to go to Budapest in Hungary for a while, and I decided to take it. So I'm actually in Budapest now, and I will be till late May, feeling like extending it a bit longer. It's a lovely city, despite their government. But I'm just feeling very inspired to do my own work. So yeah, I think I'll stick around, and hopefully I'll have time in the evenings to make videos on a regular basis. So in the meantime, I want to start with something that really, frankly, has been annoying me over the past couple of weeks, and that is Noam Chomsky's takes on the Ukraine war. Now, everyone who has seen my previous videos, anyone who's followed me on Twitter, knows that, well, I think I am among the minority of leftists who am virtually unequivocally in support of Ukraine. I feel that they need to win this war militarily. I feel that they need all the assistance possible to win that war militarily. I think the only way in which Russia can be pushed to the negotiating table in any type of agreement that could be acceptable to the Ukrainian side requires Russia to lose on the battlefield. And I figure that as time goes by, the possibility that the Ukrainian military can not only defeat the Russian military in terms of defending its territory. I think that is all but obvious that it's happening already. But hopefully in the near future, achieve some degree of offensive capability as well, and be able to counterattack Russia in certain key sectors, and hopefully take back some of the territory that has been lost in the south and in the east. Now, can they take all of it? I'm not sure. Honestly, I doubt it. But I think the fact that Russia is again on the offensive, is again losing badly, is not making progress in its Donbass assault, will make their army weaker and will enable Ukraine to take the offensive at some point, particularly with the weapons that now the West has been promising. At the beginning, it was mostly defensive weaponry, like anti-tank weapons, anti-air weapons. Now they're getting weapons that are useful both in defense and offense. So the artillery systems, things like that, those will give it, tanks that some of the European countries are providing it, those will help Ukraine be able to undertake some limited degree of strategic counteroffensive at some point. And I think that's the only way that you will get Russia to the negotiating table and an agreement that is acceptable to Ukraine. Now, how that negotiation will take shape, I think right now no one really knows how, but I've seen a significant amount of leftists, very well-known leftists, particularly in the Jacobin current affairs circle. I'm talking about Nathan Robinson, Ben Burgess, Branko Marcetic, and now Chomsky, continue to argue this kind of very fanciful idea that the West needs to push Russia into negotiating. I have no idea how they plan to achieve this. They've never said how. They just said that the political objectives of the U.S. should be not to arm Ukraine, because who knows where those weapons are going to end up. Now that Azov is practically non-existent because they were defending Mariupol, I really think that whole argument of where the weapons are going to fall is a bit moot, but they're still pushing it. And yeah, I still don't know. I mean, Putin is ultimately the guy who will decide whether he will negotiate or not. And I'm not sure the US has any leverage on what Putin is going to do. So until they explain how they expect Russia to go to the negotiating table, how the US is going to do this, I think all of this is just complete, utter, and I'm going to be very frank, complete, utter horseshit. And it's all part of this, very subtle apologism of what Russia is doing, because I don't think they're arguing in good faith. I think genuinely they are ultimately campists who believe that any form of, any situation in which the West ends up weaker is a good thing for humanity. And I don't think this is a case. I mean, I'm not a fan of Western imperialism, but I would be in favor of a more multipolar world. But I don't think this particular situation is one in which I would want to see a country like Russia strengthened at the expense of the West. In fact, I don't see any scenario in which Russia should be strengthened in any way. So let's look at the latest Chomsky interview, which he did to a channel called EduKitchen. And I think this is probably the worst one. He's given now a couple. He gave one to The Intercept. He gave one to Current Affairs. And in all of these, he has said something that I found egregious, if not factually incorrect, and somewhat morally reprehensible. But this one, I think, takes the cake. So let's see 2 segments of this video. And I'm going to explain to you why these particular statements are very problematic.
Well, let's move on to the crisis itself. Where are we now? I was wondering today. I read on the White House website that Joe Biden added another $800 million to the Ukrainian aid, or adding it up to $2 billion since his administration started. I was wondering, what kind of narrative do you tell the Americans in order to support this kind of spendings?
I mean, for me, this is very easy. For once, you're actually on the good side, because the U.S. has not been on the good side in quite a while. So a rare case in which the U.S. is on the good side here. And I think we need to be, however uncomfortable U.S. imperialism or Western imperialism makes you feel, the fact of the matter is that there have been countries that have been otherwise reprehensible in many ways that have been on the good side of conflict. And, classic case of this would be the Soviet Union during World War II. I think no one in their right minds would want to defend Stalin or his record, all the horrible things he did. The fact is, the USSR was invaded with the explicit intention of being exterminated as a country, as a culture, as a people. Exactly what Russia was originally planning to do with Ukraine. So, again, however uncomfortable defending Stalin might make you feel, in that particular instance, it was entirely justified to support the Soviet Union. And the West did that. I mean, the Soviet Union was supported militarily. Billions of allied aid was given to them, tanks, weapons, thousands of allied soldiers died, bringing them all that Lend-Lease material. So that was entirely justified, if you ask me. No one was asking, who's going to pay for this? Why aren't we investing in other things? Where are those weapons where are those Spitfires and Sherman tanks gonna end up with? So no one was asking those questions then. I'm pretty sure that the Franco Marchettiches and Ben Burgesses of the world, if they existed back in the 1940s, would not be asking those questions. You would not have Jacobin articles on where that Lend-Lease money would go to. Same as, for example, the support of the Republicans during the Spanish Civil War. Was anyone questioning where all those weapons were going to, what hands they would fall? No. See, leftists, we have been very, very fine, very comfortable with certain countries supplying the countries that we like, which are fighting the causes that we want, with weapons and manpower. We've been okay with that. So I find it incredibly hypocritical that we suddenly take this incredible standard, very, very rigorous standard of, where is every single rifle and every single bullet ending up with? This is ridiculous. And finding excuses on why we should not give the weapons that Ukraine needs, not just to defend itself, to potentially win this war.
What Biden's policies on Ukraine.
How do you sell? What do you tell your own people?
Well, there is fortunately one statesman in the United States and Europe who has laid out, a person of a high political figure who has made a very sensible statement about how you can solve the crisis, namely by facilitating negotiations instead of undermining them, and moving towards establishing some kind of accommodation in Europe, maybe along in which there are no military alliances, but just mutual accommodation.
So this is the compromise that Chomsky and this politician, which he will later reveal, wait for it, is basically, well, I guess, some territorial sacrifices, maybe give up the Donbass, give up the areas currently under Russian control. I guess Ukraine's gotta swallow that bitter pill, and let's get rid of NATO. Let's just not offer any security guarantees for any country that borders Russia. That would probably be next on the list. This is ridiculous. Okay.
He didn't say it, but it's something like what George H.W. Bush, the first Bush, not the second, proposed in the early 90s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, proposed what they called a partnership for peace, which would be open for Europeans generally, Eurasians as well. It wouldn't eliminate NATO, but he would live up to the promise that NATO would not expand to the east, firm promise to Gorbachev. Keep to that.
Okay, so he's factually incorrect about this, because that whole promise about not moving east, which has been quoted endlessly by every leftist, playing the whole, Putin bad, but NATO, it's really NATO's fault, that argument. Even by Gorbachev's own admission, he has said that not an inch to the east statement was referring to NATO bases in East Germany. That was the part of the treaty that they settled between NATO and the Soviet Union after the reunification of Germany, that NATO would not put any base on East German soil. And this was at a time when the Soviet Union was not on the... No one thought the USSR was going to collapse. The reunification of Germany took place in 1990. So over a year before the Soviet Union disintegrated, Christmas of 1991. So this was 1990. This was the treaty which explicitly said no NATO bases in East Germany after unification. And NATO kept its part of the deal. To this day, there are no NATO bases in former East German territory. All NATO bases are the old NATO bases that existed during the Cold War. And in fact, again, a fact that will make a lot of leftists very uncomfortable is that NATO did not have any permanent base in any of the countries in Eastern Europe, the former Soviet republics or Warsaw Pact countries that later joined NATO voluntarily, because I know this bothers a lot of people, voluntarily joined NATO. There was no NATO base in any of these countries. There was no NATO permanent presence in any of these countries. There were no NATO weapons stocked in any of these countries, much less offensive weapons that could hit Russia. And I dare any of you who still buys into this talking point, which is demonstrably false, please, in the comments, show me a link. Show me a link of any permanent presence that NATO had. And the year in which that changed was 2014. And that was as a result of Russia's invasion of the Crimea and the Donbass. So after 2014 is the first time in which NATO began considering the possibility of having a permanent presence in some of these Eastern European countries. And I believe it was in 2016 at the NATO summit that year in which they finally agreed. And yes, now there are a number of NATO bases. There is a permanent US presence in certain countries, I think Romania, Poland. There are NATO battle groups in the Baltics. These are very small units, I should add. Probably no more than a battalion or brigade size. That's it. This is not a NATO army stationed in Eastern Europe. These are a couple of bases, forward logistics. I think there's something like 3,000. There was 3,000 US troops in Poland. These aren't big numbers. They're probably going to be strengthened now. So ironically, it's Russian aggression that is actually making NATO do the things that all the tankies and are claiming NATO did to escalate the conflict. So again, you don't believe me? Do your own research. Please, in the comments, tell me what permanent NATO presence there was in a former Eastern European or former Soviet republic from the moment they joined NATO until after 2014. And the answer is none.
Allow NATO there, but kind of de-emphasize it so other countries could join, including Russia for that matter, join the Partnership for Peace. Tajikistan joined, for example, not NATO, and move towards a world, a Europe, Eurasia with no military alliances. Actually, de Gaulle had similar vision. Emmanuel Macron, in his initiatives trying to contact Putin, suggested something similar. So going back to the one Western statesman, he didn't mention all of this, but he suggested something similar. Move towards negotiations and diplomacy instead of escalating the war. Try to see if you can bring about an accommodation, which would be roughly along these lines. His name is Donald J. Trump, the one statesman I know of in the West. Not my favorite person, incidentally. I think he's the most dangerous person maybe in history, but let's tell the truth. He's the one person who said it, and it's the right way out. Others have said it too, but not in high positions.
Okie doke. So that's funny, really, coming from a guy who argued this. Biden's foreign policy is largely indistinguishable from Trump's, and yet somehow Trump is the guy who the only one who has a solution to this conflict. Remind you that Donald Trump was the guy who said that the U.S. should bomb Russia with F-22s painted with Chinese military, Chinese Air Force insignia. That is the genius master military strategist known as Donald J. Trump. So that's the guy who has the plan, according to Noam Chomsky. And, well, you can understand why saying something like this is not only, I would say, genuinely stupid, definitely unbecoming of someone like Noam Chomsky. But I don't think he understands the consequences of making statements like this, because this statement was immediately picked up by none other than Glenn Greenwald, who tweeted it. That's how I ended up noticing this. And I'm sure all his 1 point something million followers now see this. Glenn Greenwald, one of the main figures of this leftists who argue leftist talking points rhetorically, but really they're far right. Incredibly anti-woke, incredibly transphobic, misogynistic, everything in the right-wing playbook, except, a couple of left-wing economic takes here and there, but they're mostly right-wing. And these are the people, along with the tankies, who I think will hear a statement like this and will vote Trump in 2024 if he runs, which I have a feeling he will. I have no doubt these people will vote for Trump because they will use this as the excuse that Trump is the only guy who really wants, world peace. Just like a lot of the other, dumb leftists like Jimmy Dore were probably going to use the excuse of mask mandates and vaccine authoritarianism to vote Republican. Kim Iverson said it openly. Like, I'm voting Republican because they're the only ones who are against all this vaccine authoritarianism and mask mandate dictatorships. So that's what they're pushing people towards. And again, I am genuinely surprised that Chomsky is completely unaware. Maybe he needs to be on Twitter, honestly. He's not on Twitter, but maybe he should. Maybe he should, dip his feet into, see what's out there. And I know that Twitter is horrible, but, if you want to get a feel for how a lot of people are understanding, or rather misunderstanding politics, you kind of have to be there. And I'm not sure he realizes just how many people are going to listen to this and decide this moment. They probably already decided, but now they're just going to have it reinforced. That's going to be even harder to convince them otherwise. These are left-wingers who will probably vote for Trump and who maybe by 2024 will have shed any pretense that they are actually left-wingers. But that is the danger in statements like this. Now, there's another part of this interview that I thought was really, really disgusting. So we're going to listen to this now.
In fact, it's quite interesting to look at the way this is playing out in the intellectual.
Oh, so as a prelude, they're discussing language, and there's the use of language in war, and kind of tying it in with Chomsky's manufactured consent, this theory of manufactured consent, which is probably his most important intellectual contribution to the left. I think it's really what stands out about his views in the past, because frankly, I've never liked Chomsky's anti-war takes, and I think a lot of the left has taken this Chomskyite view of ultimately there are bad people in this world and bad things happen, but somehow or another you can trace all those bad things and all those bad people to the West. So ultimately the West is the only instigator of evil in this world, because no matter how bad other people are, what authoritarian dictator in the Middle East or wherever, whatever, Russian despot, whatever they do, ultimately it's a reaction to Western imperialism, Western foreign policy. So you end up with people who are just intellectually incapable of ever assigning blame or assigning, like an origin story of that blame to any country that is ostensibly anti-West. So these are the same, and they've had practice now. They had practice with Syria, defending Bashir al-Assad and all the horrible things he did, including chemical weapon attacks against his own people, which leftists continue to deny happened. Now defending what Russia is doing. And, we all grew up in an era where a lot of the most horrible foreign policy decisions were in fact taken by the US. I mean, the invasion of Iraq, completely illegal, completely unjustified, completely unprovoked. And I mentioned this word unprovoked because that is going to be the root of this argument that he gives. So let's keep watching.
intellectual world, speaking of language, take the phrase unprovoked invasion of Ukraine, the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's de rigueur. Anybody who wants to talk about it has to call it the unprovoked invasion of Ukraine.
No, you don't. You don't. I'm sorry, but you don't. I mean, this is, I mean, I've seen plenty of mentions of the word unprovoked invasion, but this is not like the standard. Even on, CNN or MSNBC or whatever, liberal warmonger outlet you can find. I don't think this is the standard way of referring to the war at all.
Just out of curiosity, I did a Google search for the phrase unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. 2.5 million cases in 30 seconds. Then I did another search. Unprovoked invasion of Iraq. 11,000, all of them from anti-war people. That's kind of interesting in itself, but it's even more interesting because it totally inverts the facts. The invasion of Iraq was totally unprovoked. In fact, Cheney and Rumsfeld had to
Okay, so why don't we do that test? Okay? Unprovoked, I spelled it wrong. Invasion of Iraq. 308,000 results. That's considerably more than what he's mentioning. And note that I'm doing this Google search from Hungary, so it might be leaving out a lot of different sources. Now, obviously, this is there's going to be way more on Ukraine because it's a recent conflict, but that's a lot of links, links as well. So, this is almost 20 years ago. Not exactly the ideal comparison of trying to find internet sources as there is today. So,
resort to torture to try to elicit some shred of evidence that Saddam was cooperating with Al-Qaeda. Of course, there wasn't any. We don't have to talk about the disappearing weapons of mass destruction. There was no reason to believe they existed. So the invasion of Iraq was totally unprovoked. In contrast, the invasion of Ukraine was demonstrably provoked. Read.
Here's where we're going to get into a lot of intellectual difficulties, okay? This is where I think he finally sheds the veneer. And this is very problematic because what we're going to see is basically a semantic game being played between the words unprovoked and the words legitimized. And it's very easy, as he will do now, to basically claim that this invasion was provoked, but then claim that that doesn't legitimize it. And I'll explain in a bit why this is a massive, massive cop-out.
The Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, pointed out that since 2014, NATO, meaning the United States, has been sending advanced weapons to Ukraine, carrying out military operations with Ukraine. Last September 1st.
Gee, I wonder why they were sending weapons. Could it have been the unprovoked Russian invasion of Crimea and the Donbass? Maybe that's the reason why? I suspect. Funny how he doesn't mention this. He's trying to make it seem like just in the years before this invasion, the US was just arming Ukraine to the teeth, as if there was no reason why they would do it. Incredibly, incredibly disingenuous.
You can find it on the White House webpage. Joe Biden's administration produced a policy statement calling for enhanced integration of Ukraine into NATO, increased joint military exercises with the U.S., more weapons sent, and so on. extended this in March.
By the way, all that training that happened in the last couple of years is the reason Ukraine is not losing that war. So every single Ukrainian alive today is absolutely fucking grateful that during those years NATO helped train the Ukrainian military and that NATO contributed all those weapons, provided them all those weapons to be able to defend themselves. Because if that had not happened, Professor Chomsky, Ukraine would not exist today. Half of the country would probably have been annexed by Russia, and the other half would now be left with some Belarus-like puppet state. Every library in Ukraine would have had its books burned. Every poet, intellectual, musician, writer who didn't manage to flee Ukraine would now be somewhere in a Russian prison camp, possibly to be killed, if not already killed. The intention of Russia was to eradicate Ukraine as a distinct, independent nation and culture. When Putin says Russia and Ukraine are one, he doesn't mean it as in brotherly love one. He means Ukraine should not exist as an entity separate from Russia. And nowhere will you ever hear Chomsky or any of the other online leftist clowns who are defending Chomsky say this, because it's very uncomfortable and it brings down all their other arguments down.
The Department of State has officially stated that prior to the invasion, the United States refused to consider any Russian security concerns.
Again, this argument on the security concerns. Why doesn't Palestine accept Israel's legitimate security concerns? Because we don't think they're legitimate. So there's no reason why the countries that neighbor Russia should think that Russia's security concerns are legitimate or any more legitimate than their security interest. Because the risk for these countries is, like Ukraine, to no longer exist. What's the risk for Russia? What will NATO do to Russia? Does anyone seriously think NATO has a plan for invading and destroying Russia? Of course they don't. Of course they don't. So, like I said, all these years in which NATO expanded to the east, and not a single NATO base was placed on these countries until after the invasion of Crimea. What grounds does Russia have to claim that their security issues are, that their internal security, their national security, is threatened by NATO? I'm sorry. This is just BS, pure BS, pure Kremlin propaganda that is being defended right now by this guy and by all the leftist clowns who tomorrow will, if not they've already done it, put their tweets in defense of everything that he says.
Approximately the words. So yes, it was definitely a provoked invasion. Doesn't legitimize it. It's pure aggression, criminal aggression. But the facts are exactly 100% the opposite of 100% intellectual behavior. Okay?
What does that even mean? What does that even mean?
Well, that tells you how, it's a good one of many indications of how the intellectual world, including mostly liberals, line up in support of state power.
Well, I'm pretty sure that every single Russian propagandist, every single member of Russia's government will listen to this interview if they get a chance, and they will love it. I bet you anything. I bet you they will have no complaints over anything that Chomsky just said. And this brings me back to the issue of provoked. It's a provoked invasion, but it's not legitimate, so it's illegal. Okay, by saying that it's illegal, by saying that it's criminal, you kind of want to make it seem like the provocation, really, there's an ulterior form of aggression or crime being committed. But that's not what people hear. You know what I mean? When you say, okay, this was bad, but it was provoked, the people who defend that act will justify it on the virtue of that provocation. Okay? If someone looks at you funny in a nightclub and you go up and you punch them in the face, you can say that action was illegal, but it was provoked because he was looking at you funny. And anyone who believes that that they should have the right to punch people because they look at them funny will definitely be like, yeah, that was provoked. The better example is any woman who's ever been raped. Was it provoked? Well, she was wearing a miniskirt. She was wearing a tight dress. I'm not saying that's, what that legitimizes it, but they maybe they should have worn something else. Does any leftist ever make this case? Of course they don't, because we know that not only is it illegal, immoral, unethical to punch people in a nightclub or rape someone, we also think that the provocation is really in your head, right? It's in the aggressor's head. And this is exactly what he's doing. He's repeating Kremlin propaganda because those are the same arguments that they use. You look at every single statement that Putin says, every single batshit insane Russian talk show these days. You can find the translated versions on Twitter. There's numerous accounts that are constantly tweeting everything that appears in Russia state TV over there. This is the exact same argument you will hear from these people. So yes, in fact, you are legitimizing it. And saying that it was illegal, saying that it's criminal, saying that it's barbaric, that does not in any way offset the fact that you are basically giving every single argument that every defender of Russia's aggression will want to use. And that's what he's doing. And that's what the Branko Marshevich of this world are doing, publishing, a new piece every 3 or 4 days in Jacobin, finding some way to justify something or put the blame on the West. That's what they're doing. That's what everyone has said. Well, we shouldn't arm Ukraine because, the risks here. That's what they're doing. So I just think at this point, this is indefensible. I think that, I know that Chomsky's old, but his brain still looks like it's functioning 100%. He is a lucid individual. He knows what he's saying. What I think he doesn't know is the audience that will be most receptive to this message is not the audience of brave anti-war protesters and activists. It's an audience of dumb leftists, post-leftists, and far-right sympathizers. And the Kremlin. That's the audience for what Chomsky is saying. And I really don't know what to say other than I weep for the left. I seriously do. And you saw me make some statements in my last video. I am incredibly depressed at the state of the left. the intellectual state of the left, and how it is that they are in the face of, I think, the easiest moral decision in war. And war is messy. War is never that black and white. This is a rare case of a conflict that is as close to black and white as there is. And you still find people spending every single waking moment of their life trying to find a way of not calling a spade a spade. And that's embarrassing. I feel embarrassed to, these days on Twitter, like whatever we argue as leftists on other things, on, social policy, etc., goes down the fucking drain when people hear us justifying Russian aggression like this with the arguments that Chomsky just gave. It all goes down the drain. We lose complete respect. And we lose, all the legitimacy that was built up when it was the US doing the aggression around the world. When it was perhaps just only a handful of tankies defending Bashar al-Assad in Syria or Russia in Syria. No, now it's a good part of the online leftist ecosystem that is repeating arguments like this and blissfully unaware of who the audience for this is and the consequences of what that audience is going to do. So, and it's sad because for the past year or 2 years, a significant amount of the online left rightfully called out all the people who sort of fell into the Jimmy Dore orbit, all these other, the Glenn Greenwald orbit. And on this take, they're allies. So think about that for a sec. And yeah, I think I've said everything that needs to be said. Just a very disappointing interview. Even more disappointing than his current affairs and his Intercept interviews. I think just the fact that he openly says that this is a provoked conflict is stupid. Is absolutely stupid. There's no other words to say it. This is intellectually lazy, based on factual inaccuracies, and just morally reprehensible. And I have nothing good to say about it. So, on that note, if you like this video, please like, please share. Most importantly, please subscribe to the channel. I promise. I should not promise things because my last promises on making videos on a regular basis have not been kept. So I'm not going to promise anything, but I think I'll have more time to do this stuff. So, yes, please stick around, and I'll see you next time.